Jimi was fired for being too good. His boss was Little Richard. What happened next is legendary. October 1964. Jimi Hendrix, still going by Jimi at the time, was 21 years old and broke. He'd been bouncing around the Chitlin circuit for years, playing backup guitar for whoever would hire him. The Isley Brothers, Curtis Knight, various R&B acts nobody remembers anymore. The Chitlin circuit was the network of venues across the American South that catered to black audiences during segregation. Small clubs, theaters, juke joints where black performers could work when white venues wouldn't book them. The pay was terrible, maybe $25 a night plus a meal if he was lucky. Some nights he made $15. Some nights he made nothing but tips thrown on stage. He slept on couches when he was lucky, in the band van when he wasn't, sometimes in bus stations when he had nowhere else to go. His guitar was his most valuable possession, a beat-up Fender he'd saved for months to buy. He'd eat one meal a day to afford new strings. But he was learning his craft, paying his dues, watching every guitarist he could, stealing techniques, developing his style, waiting for a shot at something bigger. Then he got hired by Little Richard. This wasn't just any gig. Little Richard was a genuine rock and roll pioneer, one of the founding fathers. Tutti Frutti, Long Tall Sally, Good Golly Miss Molly, these were massive hits that had helped create rock and roll as a genre. Working for Little Richard meant steady pay, real venues, a professional tour. For a struggling backup guitarist, this was hitting the lottery.
Jimi couldn't believe his luck. He was going to be playing with a legend, learning from one of the best performers in the business. He'd finally have some financial stability, some credibility. Maybe Little Richard would mentor him, help him develop as an artist. The first few shows went well. Jimi did his job, played the parts exactly as arranged, stayed in the background, supported Little Richard's vocals. He was professional, reliable, showed up on time, didn't cause problems. Everything a backup musician should be. But Jimi couldn't help himself. He was too good, too creative, too magnetic. Even when he tried to stay in the background, his playing drew attention. During guitar solos, when he was supposed to play simple, straightforward riffs, Jimi would add little flourishes, bending notes in ways that made them sing, adding runs that weren't in the arrangement but fit perfectly, playing with a feel and intensity that made people in the audience turn their heads to see who was making those sounds. He'd play behind his head sometimes, not as a planned stunt, but just because it felt natural to him. He'd make faces when he played, lost in the music, completely absorbed. The crowd loved it. They'd watch Jimi as much as they watched Little Richard. And Little Richard noticed. After a show in Nashville, Little Richard called Jimi to his dressing room. Jimi thought maybe he was getting a raise, or a compliment on his playing, or maybe advice on his technique. Instead, when Jimi walked in, Little Richard was sitting at his makeup mirror, still in his stage costume, looking angry in the reflection.
"Close the door," Little Richard said. Jimi closed it, suddenly nervous. "You trying to steal my show?" Little Richard asked, still looking at Jimi through the mirror, not turning around. Jimi was confused. "What? No, sir. I'm just playing guitar the way I know how." "You're doing too much," Little Richard said, finally turning to face him. "All that fancy playing, the tricks with the guitar behind your head, making faces like you're possessed by the devil. People are watching you instead of me. This is my show. You're supposed to be in the background. You're supposed to make me sound good, not make people forget I'm even on stage." "I'm sorry," Jimi said, genuinely apologetic. "I didn't mean to take attention away from you. I was just feeling the music. That's how I play." "Well, feel it less," Little Richard said sharply. "I don't care what you meant. I care what happened. I'm the star. You're the backup. Act like it. Play the parts as written. No more showing off. No more guitar tricks. Just play your part and stay in your lane." Jimi nodded. He understood. This was Little Richard's show. Jimi was hired help. He needed to know his place. For the next few shows, Jimi tried to dial it back. He played simpler parts, stayed more still on stage, tried not to draw attention. But it was like asking a bird not to fly. Music wasn't just a job to Jimi. It was who he was. When he played, he couldn't help but express himself. And the crowds kept watching him. 2 weeks later, after a show in Atlanta, Little Richard called another meeting. His tour manager was there too. The vibe was tense.
"I told you to stop upstaging me," Little Richard said. "I've been trying," Jimi started. "Not hard enough," Little Richard cut him off. "Tonight, during Long Tall Sally, half the audience was watching you instead of me. You were making faces, bending over the guitar like you were in pain. It's distracting. It's disrespectful." "I'm just feeling the music," Jimi said. "Feel it quieter," Little Richard snapped. "This is my last warning. You're a good player, but you're replaceable. There's 100 guitarists who'd kill for this gig. If you can't stay in your lane, I'll find someone who can." Jimi felt frustrated, but held his tongue. He needed this job. He'd try harder to blend in, but here's the thing about trying to dim your own light. It's exhausting and ultimately impossible. 3 weeks later, October 29th, 1964, in New York City, everything came to a head. The tour was playing the Apollo Theater in Harlem, a legendary venue, the most important stage for black performers in America. This was a big deal. Packed house, important show, music industry people in attendance. Jimi tried his best to stay in the background, to play it safe, to not draw attention. But during the guitar solo on Tutti Frutti, something happened. Jimi closed his eyes and just played. He forgot where he was, forgot he was supposed to hold back, forgot about Little Richard's warnings. He just let the music flow through him. His fingers flew across the fretboard like they had a mind of their own. He bent strings until they screamed and cried. He swung the guitar behind his head while still playing perfectly, then brought it back around and played with his teeth. The crowd went absolutely insane, jumping out of their seats, screaming, pointing at this skinny kid in the background who was making sounds nobody had heard before.
When the song ended, Jimi opened his eyes to thunderous applause. People were pointing at him, shouting, "Who is that?" trying to see his face. He'd stolen the show completely, totally, undeniably. Little Richard was furious. Jimi could see it in his face, the tight jaw, the narrow eyes, the way he cut the show short by 2 songs. As soon as they walked off stage, before Jimi could even put his guitar down, Little Richard grabbed him by the arm. "You're done," Little Richard said, his voice shaking with anger. "You're fired. Pack your shit." "What? I don't care. You can't help yourself. You're too much. This is my show and you keep making it about you. I warned you. I gave you chances. You're fired. Get your stuff and get out of my tour bus." Jimi stood there stunned, backstage at the Apollo Theater, the most important venue for black performers in America, and he'd just been fired. He'd just lost the best gig of his career at the worst possible place. Everyone would hear about this. He was back to being broke, back to sleeping on couches, back to square one. Worse than square one, because now he had a reputation as someone who couldn't stay in his lane. Little Richard's tour manager handed Jimi an envelope with 2 weeks' pay, the legally required severance, about $150. "Nothing personal, kid," he said, not unkindly. "You're talented. Hell, you might be the most talented guitarist I've ever seen. But you're not a backup player. You're a star. You just can't do that behind someone else. You need your own show, your own band, your own spotlight. You're never going to be happy, and nobody's going to be happy with you until you accept that." Jimi took the envelope and left. He sat on a bench outside the venue, trying to figure out what to do next. He had maybe $300 to his name. No apartment, no prospects. He'd just been fired for being too good at his job.
Years later, Little Richard would tell the story differently. In a 1980s interview, he said, "I didn't fire Jimi because he was bad. I fired him because he was too good. He was upstaging me every single night. I couldn't compete with that. And I knew even then that kid was going to be bigger than me someday. I just couldn't have him doing it on my stage." The interviewer asked, "Do you regret firing him?" Little Richard paused. "Yes and no. No, because I had to protect my show. I was the headliner. I'd worked too hard to be upstaged by my own guitar player. But yes, because I could have been part of his story. I could have helped him, mentored him, been the guy who discovered Jimi Hendrix. Instead, I'm the guy who fired him. That's a much less interesting story." After being fired, Jimi spent the next year and a half grinding harder than ever, playing any gig he could get, no matter how small, how poorly paid, how degrading. He played with Wilson Pickett, Sam Cooke, Ike and Tina Turner, the Supremes backing band, always as a backup, always being told to tone it down, always being told he was too much, too flashy, too distracting. Some band leaders loved him. Others fired him within weeks for the same reason Little Richard had. He couldn't help but shine. He lived in a tiny apartment in Harlem that he shared with 3 other musicians. They split the $80 a month rent 4 ways. He ate at the cheapest diners, often just ordering toast and coffee to stretch his money. He wore the same stage clothes until they were threadbare. But his guitar was always in perfect condition, always clean, always well-maintained. That was his tool, his voice, his future. He practiced obsessively, 6, 8, 10 hours a day when he wasn't working gigs. He'd play along with records, trying to match B.B. King's tone, Albert King's vibrato, Muddy Waters' feel. He'd experiment with new techniques, new sounds, new ways of making the guitar speak. Every dismissal, every firing, every "you're too much" made him more determined to find a situation where too much was exactly right.
Then, in September 1966, Chaz Chandler saw him playing at Cafe Wah in New York. Chaz didn't tell Jimi to tone it down. Chaz said, "Come to London. Be yourself. Be as much as you want to be." 2 months after that, Jimi was the most talked-about guitarist in London. 6 months after that, Hey Joe was a hit. 1 year after that, the Jimi Hendrix Experience released Are You Experienced, one of the most influential albums in rock history. By 1968, Jimi was the highest-paid guitarist in the world, headlining festivals, changing what people thought was possible with a guitar. And Little Richard? Still a legend, still respected, still performing, but no longer the biggest star in rock and roll. That title now belonged to the guitarist he'd fired for being too good. In 1969, Jimi and Little Richard crossed paths at a music festival. Backstage, Little Richard approached Jimi. "Hey, man," Little Richard said. Jimi turned, recognized him, and smiled. "Hey, I owe you an apology," Little Richard said. "I fired you because I was threatened. You were so good, so natural, so magnetic. I couldn't handle it. I should have helped you, not held you back." Jimi shook his head. "You don't owe me anything. You gave me a shot when I was nobody. You paid me when I needed money. And honestly, getting fired was the best thing that could have happened to me. How's that? Because as long as I was working for you, I was trying to be smaller than I was, trying to fit into your show. When you fired me, I had to figure out my own show. I had to be myself or starve. Turns out, being myself worked out pretty well."
Little Richard laughed. "Yeah, I'd say it did. You're Jimi Hendrix now. That's not nothing." "And you're Little Richard," Jimi replied. "That's not nothing either. You're one of the reasons I wanted to play music in the first place. I learned a lot watching you perform, how to command a stage, how to give everything to the audience. That was valuable." They talked for a while, 2 legends who'd briefly crossed paths when one was ascending and the other had plateaued. There was no bitterness, no resentment, just 2 artists who understood the business, understood ego, understood that sometimes getting fired is the universe's way of saying you're meant for something bigger. Little Richard would tell the story of firing Jimi for the rest of his life. Sometimes he told it with pride, "I fired Jimi Hendrix," as if it proved how important he was. Other times, he told it with regret. "I fired Jimi Hendrix because I was insecure." But the truth was somewhere in the middle. Little Richard was protecting his career, his brand, his moment in the spotlight. He wasn't wrong to fire Jimi. The dynamic wasn't working. Jimi was too big to be anyone's backup. And Jimi wasn't wrong to be himself. He couldn't dim his light just to make someone else shine brighter. That's not how talent works. That's not how art works. The lesson from this story isn't never fire talented people or always let your employees shine. The lesson is that some people are meant to be supporting players, and some people are meant to be stars. And when a star is forced to play support, eventually something has to give. Jimi tried to be a backup guitarist. He really did. But his talent was too large, his creativity too powerful, his presence too magnetic. He couldn't help but steal the show. Getting fired by Little Richard hurt at the time, but it forced Jimi to stop trying to be someone's backup and start being Jimi Hendrix. And that made all the difference.
Jimi was fired for being too good. His boss was Little Richard. What happened next was that the fired backup guitarist became the greatest guitarist in rock history, while the boss who fired him became a footnote in that story. Sometimes getting fired is the best thing that can happen to you. Sometimes being told you're too much means you're exactly enough, just not for that situation. If this story of rejection turning into destiny moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who's been told they're too much, too loud, too ambitious. Have you ever been fired for being too good? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like this video for more untold stories of legends who turned setbacks into comebacks.